Phil Collins knows that his 5 children were called to a hospital in Switzerland because the people closest to him were no longer certain he would survive. He knows this now because others have told him. What he cannot do is remember them arriving. That missing piece sits at the center of the story Phil has only recently chosen to tell. The medical crisis did not happen this week or even this year. It reached its most dangerous point in 2024. But until his recent interview at the age of 75, the public did not know how close his family had come to losing him. Phil had been seriously ill for months. The timeline reported in the press is not completely straightforward, but his treatment appears to have begun in late 2023, followed by a brief period outside the hospital, and then another severe decline. By April 2024, he was unconscious in a Swiss hospital. His kidneys were failing. Other organs were beginning to shut down. According to Phil, there were discussions around whether he should remain on life support. He did not present those conversations as something he clearly heard or participated in. At the time, he was in no condition to understand what was happening around him. His longtime manager, Tony Smith, faced a decision no manager expects to make after decades of arranging albums, tours, and public appearances. He contacted Phil's children. Jolie, Simon, Lily, Nick, and Matthew were told to come because this might be their final opportunity to see their father alive. The available accounts do not tell us exactly how those calls unfolded. We do not know who answered first, what each child was told, or whether all 5 reached the hospital at the same moment. It would be easy to create a dramatic scene around that room, but the family has not publicly supplied those details. What Phil has confirmed is difficult enough. People were coming to say goodbye, he recalled. Then he added that he did not remember them coming. He had no idea it was happening. Think about what that means from both sides. His children may remember traveling to Switzerland while trying to prepare themselves for the possibility that their father would never wake up. They may remember entering the hospital, waiting for information, and looking at a man who could not respond to them. Phil remembers none of that. For him, those hours are not personal memories. They are events reconstructed from medical accounts and from the people who remained conscious beside him. Survival can make a moment like this appear less final when it is described afterward. We know Phil eventually woke up. We know he left the hospital. We know he is now sober. His children did not know any of that when they received the call. At the time, they were not arriving for a difficult visit with a guaranteed reunion ahead. They were coming because people feared there might be no reunion. And before we can understand what brought 5 children from different lives to the same hospital, we have to understand how Phil reached a condition in which his family was preparing for an ending he himself cannot remember. The call to Phil Collins's children did not come after one bad night. By the time his manager contacted them, the crisis had been building for months. According to Phil's recent account, he had returned to heavy drinking during 2023. This was not his first period of alcohol dependence. He had written about earlier struggles years before, and for a time he had used Antabuse, a medication designed to make drinking physically unpleasant. At some point, however, he stopped taking it. The exact sequence is not perfectly clear in every report. What seems consistent is that alcohol gradually returned to the center of his daily routine. Phil described drinking wine in the morning, not at a celebration, not with dinner, at breakfast. That detail is easy to repeat for shock value, but it also tells you something practical. The drinking was no longer limited to evenings or occasional lapses. It had begun shaping the entire day. By November 2023, he was admitted to a hospital in Switzerland. Reports say his pancreas and kidneys had been damaged. He was apparently discharged briefly before Christmas, but the improvement did not last. He returned to medical care, and the months that followed became increasingly difficult to separate in his own memory. There is a temptation in stories like this to search for one clear reason: a divorce, loneliness, chronic pain, retirement, the loss of the life he once had. Phil has connected his drinking to several of those things at different times, but addiction rarely fits into a single explanation, and the people closest to it do not always agree on where one relapse truly began. What can be said is that Phil was already physically vulnerable. Years of medical problems had left him with less room for another serious strain on his body. The alcohol added that strain. By April 2024, the situation had become critical. Phil was unconscious. His kidneys were, as he put it, packing up. Other organs were seizing up. Those were his words, spoken from the distance of survival. At the time, he was not calmly observing his own decline. He was largely absent from it. Doctors were reportedly considering decisions involving life support. The public does not know exactly what options were presented, who had legal authority to decide, or how close those discussions came to action. Phil himself described them only in broad terms. That uncertainty matters. It prevents us from pretending we were inside a room the family has chosen to keep private. Still, the fact that such discussions occurred explains why Tony Smith called the children. This was no longer a difficult recovery with a predictable outcome. His organs were failing, and no one around him could promise that he would wake up. Phil later said he had been very lucky. That sounds simple now, almost understated, but luck is usually the word people use after danger has passed. During those months, the people around him did not know whether they were watching a recovery begin or a life end, and his 5 children were about to receive that uncertainty in 5 very different places. Calling Phil Collins's 5 children did not mean calling one household. By 2024, Jolie, Simon, Lily, Nick and Matthew were adults with separate homes, careers and complicated histories with their father. They were born across 3 relationships, raised in different places and separated by nearly 3 decades in age. What connected them that day was not geography. It was a message from Tony Smith. Their father was unconscious in a Swiss hospital, and they needed to come. Jolie was the eldest. Phil had adopted her after marrying her mother, Andrea Bertorelli, and she later built a career as an actress and producer in Canada. Simon, Phil's eldest son, had followed music into adulthood, becoming a singer and drummer in his own right. Lily was the child most familiar to the wider public. By then, she had an established acting career of her own. But fame does not make a hospital call easier to receive. Neither does a difficult family history. Phil and Lily had spoken publicly, at different times, about years of emotional distance. Some of that ground had already been repaired by 2024. Some parts were probably more complicated than either could explain in a newspaper interview. Then there were Nick and Matthew, Phil's younger sons, with Oriane Seavey. Nick had spent years close to his father's working life, including performing with him as a drummer. Matthew had taken a different path into professional football. Their experiences of Phil were not identical to those of the older children. They had known him at another stage of his life, under different circumstances. So, when reports say, his 5 children came to say goodbye, it sounds like a single family movement. In reality, it meant 5 people receiving the same frightening information through 5 separate lives. The exact travel arrangements have not been made public. We do not know who was nearest to Switzerland, who needed to cross a border, or who arrived after the others. We also do not know what Tony Smith said word for word. Perhaps the message was direct. Perhaps it was cautious. Families often remember calls like that differently because the mind holds on to tone, pauses, and unfinished sentences. What appears clear is why the calls were made. The doctors could not offer reassurance. Phil's organs were failing. He was unconscious, and questions involving life support had entered the conversation. His children were being given the chance to see him because no one could promise another chance would come. It is worth pausing there. These were not children gathering for a public tribute or a carefully planned family photograph. They were adults being asked to return very quickly to the most basic role they shared. They were Phil Collins's sons and daughters. Whatever distance existed between them, whatever had been said in interviews or written in books, none of it could settle the immediate question facing them. Would their father wake up? Phil later said they were worried they would never see him again. He knows that because they told him. His own memory cannot confirm their arrival. For the children, however, the journey to Switzerland belonged to them completely. And while Phil remained unconscious, they became the witnesses to a part of his life he would later have to reconstruct from their accounts. Phil Collins has described spending roughly 7 months in hospital care. That number is easy to read and difficult to picture. 7 months means seasons changing outside, while your world is reduced to medical rooms, repeated checks, unfamiliar voices and decisions made by other people. It means birthdays, workdays, and ordinary family routines continuing somewhere else, while time becomes less recognizable inside the hospital. For Phil, much of that period is incomplete. He has spoken about being unconscious during the most dangerous stage of the crisis. He knows his kidneys were failing. He knows other organs were beginning to shut down. He knows his children were called because people feared he might not survive. But knowing what happened is not the same as remembering it. There are parts of those months that appear to belong more clearly to the people around him than to Phil himself. Tony Smith would have remembered the conversations with doctors and the calls to the family. His children would have remembered their journeys, the waiting and the uncertainty. Medical staff would have recorded changes in his condition that Phil could not observe for himself. He was the person at the center of the emergency, yet in some ways he was also the person with the least complete account of it. The exact medical timeline remains somewhat unclear in public reports. Coverage indicates that he entered hospital care in late 2023, was briefly discharged around Christmas, and then became critically ill again. By April 2024, according to his recent interview, he was unconscious in Switzerland, and discussions involving life support had taken place. Phil did not describe those discussions in technical detail. He did not identify the doctors involved, explain what treatment options were offered, or say who would have been asked to make a final decision. That information remains private, as it probably should. What he remembered was the result. He had come close enough to death that people were arriving to say goodbye. When someone survives an event they cannot fully recall, the story can feel strangely borrowed. Other people supply the missing scenes. They tell you how ill you looked, what the doctor said, and who stood beside you. You listen to an account of your own life almost as though it happened to someone else. I think that may be one reason Phil's recent description feels so restrained. He did not offer a dramatic reconstruction. He could not. He simply acknowledged that his body had reached a point where his organs were failing and the people around him believed the end might be near. There is also a practical consequence to missing time. Recovery does not begin with a clear return to normality. Waking up does not immediately explain what happened. Strength has to be rebuilt. Medication changes. People repeat information. Family members may be relieved, but they are still carrying fear the patient did not consciously experience with them. Phil eventually learned that all 5 children had been called. He learned that they feared they might never see him again. Those facts became part of his understanding of the crisis, even though they never became memories. And when he finally left hospital care, the family was no longer dealing only with what had nearly happened. They also had to work out what could still happen between them. The next family gathering did not happen in a hospital. That matters. Months after the crisis in Switzerland, Phil Collins met his children again in London. Reports placed the reunion at the Mandarin Oriental in Knightsbridge, where the family spent 4 days together. 4 days is not a dramatic amount of time, but after a call that had sounded like a final goodbye, ordinary time carried a different weight. There were no public speeches, no stage, no attempt to present the family as suddenly perfect. The available accounts do not describe every conversation, and they do not tell us whether old tensions were resolved. We should be careful not to turn a private reunion into a scene the family never shared. What has been shared is enough. Lily Collins later spoke about how emotional it felt to have those days with her father. She said there had been a point when she did not know whether they would ever have that kind of time again. That sentence changes the meaning of the gathering. This was not simply a famous father having dinner with his successful children. It was a family doing something they had recently believed might no longer be possible. Perhaps they ate together. Perhaps they talked about the hospital. Perhaps they avoided it for a while. We do not know. And maybe that uncertainty makes the moment feel more real. Families rarely process fear in one clear conversation. One person wants answers. Another wants to talk about something ordinary. Someone makes a joke because silence feels too heavy. Someone else stays quiet. What mattered was that Phil was there and conscious. This time he could see his children. He could hear them, respond to them, and remember that they had come. The contrast with the hospital is difficult to miss. During the emergency, the children had gathered around a father who had no awareness of their presence. In London, The same family was given another meeting, one that could become part of Phil's memory as well as theirs. That does not erase what happened in Switzerland. It does not repair every period of absence or make 3 marriages and 5 different childhoods suddenly simple. A brush with death can bring people into the same room, but it cannot automatically resolve decades of family history. Still, it can change what people choose to do with the time left. Phil has admitted that his private life was complicated. He has also acknowledged failures as a husband and as a father. His children have their own accounts, and those accounts do not always make him comfortable, yet they came when they thought he was dying, and after he survived, they came together again. I find that more meaningful than a polished story of reconciliation. There was no claim that everything had been fixed. There was only evidence that the relationship still mattered enough for them to show up. For Lily, the reunion carried another layer. Her daughter was able to spend time with Phil too, allowing him to be present not only as a father, but as a grandfather. That may sound like a small domestic detail after an emergency involving organ failure and life support. It was probably the point. After months dominated by medical decisions and fear, the family was able to experience something ordinary: shared meals, conversations, and time that did not need to be described as a farewell. They had once traveled believing they might lose him. Now they were trying to understand what it meant to have him back. Phil Collins survived, but survival did not give him back every missing hour. That part is easy to overlook. From the outside, people tend to divide these stories into 2 simple outcomes. Someone dies, or someone recovers. But recovery is not always a clean return. Sometimes the person wakes up with a body that has changed, a routine that has changed, and parts of the story that belong more clearly to everyone else in the room. Phil knows that his 5 children were called to Switzerland. He knows they were told the situation might be final. He knows his kidneys were failing and that other organs were beginning to shut down. He knows discussions involving life support had taken place, but he does not remember his children arriving. He cannot describe the expressions on their faces, the conversations around his bed, or the moment they first understood that he might survive. Those memories remain with Jolie, Simon, Lily, Nick, and Matthew. For Phil, the account had to be assembled later. A manager tells him what calls were made. Doctors explain how serious the crisis became. His children describe what they experienced while he was unconscious. Piece by piece, he learns what happened to him almost as if he were hearing the story of another patient. That is a difficult position to explain. You are present in every detail, but absent from your own memory of it. Perhaps that is why Phil has spoken about the episode without trying to make it sound heroic. There is no great speech about defeating death. No suggestion that he woke up with everything suddenly understood. He has simply said that he was lucky, and luck in this case meant waking up at all. It meant leaving the hospital after roughly 7 months of treatment. It meant having another conversation with his children. It meant being able to see his granddaughter, eat with his family, and take part in days that were no longer organized around the possibility of a final goodbye. The life that followed has been much quieter than the life people associate with Phil Collins. He has spoken about needing full-time assistance. His health still requires attention, and ordinary tasks can involve help from other people. He is not pretending to have returned to the physical independence he once knew, but he says he is sober. That fact does not erase the damage, and it should not be treated as a neat ending to a complicated struggle. Sobriety is not a single decision made once. It is something lived through one day and then the next, especially when illness, regret, and isolation are already part of the picture. Phil has admitted that he stopped taking the medication intended to keep him from drinking. He has described how alcohol entered his mornings and how quickly the situation became dangerous. Those admissions do not make the story comfortable, but they make it more honest. There is no need to turn him into either a victim or a warning. He is a man trying to understand what his choices, his health and his family have left in front of him. And the family part remains unresolved in the most human way. His relationships with his children were never all the same. They grew up in different homes, in different countries, and during very different periods of his life. Some experienced him as an absent father. Others spent more time close to his later career. Lily has written openly about emotional distance. Phil himself has acknowledged that work and marriage failures affected the kind of father he was. A medical crisis cannot rewrite any of that. It cannot return missed years. It cannot make every child remember the same father. It cannot turn a complicated family into a simple one just because everyone entered the same hospital. What it can do is reveal what still matters. When the call came, his children were told to come. After he survived, they found another way to gather. That second meeting may be more important than the first because Phil can remember it. In London, he was not unconscious while other people spoke around him. He was present. He could see his children, listen to them, and participate in the time they shared. Lily later expressed how uncertain she had once been that such a meeting would ever happen again. There is no public account of one perfect reconciliation, no single conversation that fixed everything. And perhaps there should not be. Real families rarely reach a moment where every wound is explained and every regret is forgiven. More often, they continue with what is still possible. A meal, a visit, a few days in the same place. A grandchild meeting a grandfather who had nearly disappeared from the family before she could know him better. Those moments may appear small beside the scale of Phil's public life. But public life is not what nearly ended in that hospital. A father's life did. Now at 75, Phil is left with an unusual division between what he knows and what he remembers. He knows his children came because they feared losing him. He cannot remember seeing them there. He knows they later returned when he was conscious. That part, at least, belongs to him. Perhaps that is the only conclusion the story allows for now. Not that everything was repaired. Not that danger has disappeared. Not even that Phil fully understands how close the end came. Only that the goodbye did not become final, and the time that followed is still being decided.